Do you run an open source project? Does it seem like you never have enough time to support it? Have you considered starting one but are unsure if you can commit to it? The challenge is real. On this episode, we welcome back Philip Guo, who has been a solo maintainer of the very popular PythonTutor.com project for over 10 years. He has some non-traditional advice to help keep your sanity and keep your project going while holding down a busy full-time job. This is Talk Python to Me, episode 247, recorded December 10th, 2019. Welcome to Talk Python to Me, a weekly podcast on Python, the language, the libraries, the ecosystem, and the personalities. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Follow me on Twitter where I'm at mkennedy. Keep up with the show and listen to past episodes at talkpython.fm, and follow the show on Twitter via @talkpython. This episode is brought to you by Tidelift and Clubhouse. Please check out what they're offering during their segment. It really helps support the show. Philip, welcome back to Talk Python to Me.
All right, I'm super excited to be here. I think it's my third time here, I believe.
I do believe this is your third time here. The first time you came, we talked about the CPython source code, and we spent a lot of time talking about ceval.c. You had been doing a graduate student course walking them through basically the source code of Python to talk about interpreters, right?
Yeah. That was back when I was at the University of Rochester. That was back in the Python 2.7 days. And I've heard recently on your shows there have been people who've done updated versions for Python 3, right? Updated versions of this interpreter walk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we had Anthony Shaw on not long ago. He wrote almost a book on it. So yeah, we had a good time talking about that. And the other one was really well received as well. And it was something like geeking out in your golden years or something like that, like coming into programming basically near retirement. You'd done some research on that, right?
Yeah, so that was right when I came to UC San Diego, which is where I'm working now. And that was a research study actually done on my Python tutor platform, which we'll talk about a lot today. And it was a survey I deployed to a bunch of programmers who were, explicitly, we want to find people over 60 years old, and kind of trying to find, these people who are, 60 and plus who are learning programming in all sorts of settings. And we found all these really interesting things about them. So check out that episode.
Yeah, it was really surprising. And a lot of folks really enjoyed hearing it because I think they were in that situation. And I think they felt kind of alone, or they felt like they were doing something that was weird or was not going to work. And it turns out there's a bunch of people who really appreciated getting into programming. One of the ones that touched me was the idea of, I want to get into programming so I can help my grandchild either do robotics or automate Minecraft or something like that. Was a really interesting reason for it.
Yeah, and it was such a cool, intergenerational thing too. So that was awesome.
Yeah, for sure. So we're not going to talk about either of those things really today. We're going to talk about, as you mentioned, your project called Python Tutor at pythontutor.com, right? Do I have the domain correct?
Yep, pythontutor.com.
So you like to mix it up and keep things a little bit different, because I can go tutor myself on C++ at pythontutor.com, right?
Yeah, so the name is quite outdated, right? It started as a Python-only tool, and then it expanded to a bunch of languages, of which, C, C++, Java, and JavaScript are the most widely used. And I really need to think of a better name, but for now, it's just Python Tutor.
No, Python Tutor is fine. Yeah, keep the roots. It's kind of as if IPython notebooks didn't get renamed to Jupyter, right?
That's right. Yes, that's right.
it's something to that effect. So yeah, super cool. Before we dive into the topics though, let's focus just for a moment on kind of what you do day to day. You already told your story, how you got into programming in Python, but you said you're at the University of San Diego, where I also was a grad student for a little while. So yeah, it's a beautiful place to be. And what do you do there?
Especially in the winter. Yeah. So I'm at UCSD, or University of California, San Diego. And I'm an assistant professor in the cognitive science department. So in our department, it's a very interdisciplinary program where we have people from all sorts of backgrounds who are interested in studying the mind, studying how people interact with technology, studying, building new technologies and such. It's a very kind of vibrant interdisciplinary place. And my research and teaching interests are in a field called HCI, or human-computer interaction. So that's more widely known in industry as UX, or user experience. So I teach a bunch of courses on web development, user experience design, basically how to develop products that are very user-focused. And my research is on, a topic that I think many of your listeners would be interested in, is on, how do you build new kinds of interactive technologies to teach people programming and also increasingly now data science. So both of those are obviously super relevant to the Talk Python audience.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like super interesting research. And for a long time, I worked at a scientific company that was spun out of a cognitive science lab. And there's just a ton of interesting technology stuff going on there. We were using eye tracking, like EYE, not the letter I, tracking to understand how people interacted with software and other things. And yeah, it's a fun area to work, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, I think we have, in our cognitive science department, we have professors from all sorts of different backgrounds, from like neuroscience to psychology to linguistics to computer science, artificial intelligence, and emerging kind of interdisciplinary fields. And it's this nexus of a lot of, like you mentioned, of kind of people and minds and technology all together in one place. So it's a really unique field to be in.
Yeah, it's got a lot of kind of interdisciplinary cross-pollination stuff, more so than, I don't know, I don't want to put any discipline on the spot, but more so than maybe a lot of them, right?
Yeah, I think so. You're very diplomatic. Yeah, I mean, I originally was from a computer science department, right? So my background, my degrees are in computer science. I was at the University of Rochester in a computer science department, and that's much more, traditional single field, even though my work is clearly very interdisciplinary in education and technology and UX and everything. So,
right.
I feel very at home in a very interdisciplinary place.
Nice. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I doubt that a C Python code walkthrough would really be a big hit in a cognitive science type of thing, but certainly in the computer science world. All right, so let's talk about Python Tutor. Give us the quick picture. Like, what is this thing? I've actually been using it recently, and I'll share my experience with it, but let's start by just the elevator pitch. I'm driving in a car. I should not be pulling up websites while I'm doing so. Tell us what it's like. So
all right, so if you're in your car, if you're in your Tesla and you have your big touch screen, and while you're driving, you want to learn some code. So Python Tutor is a website. It's basically like a very simple online IDE, a very simple IDE. So you just paste in code that you find online, or you just type in code, very simple text box. And when you hit run, the really unique thing about it is that it runs your code, it shows the output, just like many online coding environments do. But what's really unique is that it steps you through step by step what's going on. And at every step, it draws diagrams of what's going on in memory. So what the stack frames are, what your global variables are, what your local variables, what the pointers are, what the values are and such. And it basically tries to emulate what a teacher would draw on the board, right? So if you had a teacher explain, what does this little bit of code do? They'll start drawing on the board, like here's some data, here's some variables, here's what they point to. And the Python Tutor tool just tries to automatically render that so that you could just either teach yourself, or you could actually use that to show someone as an instructional tool.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I feel like it addresses the situation where someone's pretty new to programming. They're starting to think about, what is a variable? What is a list? What is a data structure? What is a reference type versus a value type? What is passed by reference? What is passed by value? And all that kind of stuff that you need to start to at least just get a bit of an intuition for, if you're not necessarily doing a computer science degree, but you still need to have a sense of this thing is actually shared by multiple variables. And if I interact with it from either, it affects all of them, stuff like that. And so you can do really simple things like create a list and then assign it to multiple variables and just very clearly show how that works.
Yeah. And, the examples that we show, the list aliasing is a great one. Like, just always great to say code on the air, right? So it's, say like x equals bracket, 1 comma 2 comma 3, and then y equals x. So, it's not clear exactly what y equals x does, right? In some languages, it might actually call a copy constructor and make a copy of the list 1, 2, 3. But in Python, it happens that, y equals x it copies the reference, right? So after you do that, then x and y both point to the same list of 1, 2, 3 memory. So then if we ask you, what does y.append 4 do? And if I do y.append 4, what does x print out as? And if you see a diagram, it's very clear that x will print out as 1, 2, 3, 4 because there's only one list. But if you show people a bunch of code, x equals 1, 2, 3, y equals x, y.append 4, what does print x do? It's not at all obvious because people actually, they've done these research studies, which are fascinating, basically, which is, it's quite low tech, right? So you actually just give students a bunch of code, like introduction program students, and you ask them to either draw out what they think is happening or just say what's happening. And people have all sorts of misconceptions. They think like all sorts of different mental models, right? But the nice thing about showing the diagram is like there's one right mental model there. And once people get it, it's like bright as day, right? It's like, oh yeah, clearly X and Y point to the same thing and that's going to happen. So the diagrams really go a long way into, helping people learn these fundamentals.
Yeah, I think they really do. It's kind of the thing where it's hard to unsee it. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee. You're like, oh, well, obviously, this is what's happening in memory. Here's the list. And then all the things in the list are other things that are pointed to by the list and so on. But when you're new, you don't really know. And I think it's even more challenging when you're doing something like a class or an object, some complex thing that is, you could easily imagine, like if I have a dictionary, a bunch of dictionaries in a list, those dictionaries are in the list, right? They're allocated as part of the list. But obviously, as you put it together, you have the cool diagrams there. And I think that helps a lot. I also think it actually helps understanding memory management a little bit if you go and explore it, right? Because Python's core memory management story is reference counting. Right?
Yeah. And, it's interesting because the tool is designed to keep the visualization simple, for beginners. But you can imagine augmenting it with, if you want to make a more advanced version, maybe you put the ref counts next to everything and you actually see, if there's 3 pointers pointing and the ref count is 3, and then maybe if there's like a weak pointer, or some other thing pointing. And this is not just for Python, for like C++ or something. You can see, there's 3 real pointers and 1 weak pointer. So if every real pointer goes away, the weak pointer is still there, it can still be garbage collected or deallocated and stuff. So I think there's a lot of stuff there. And the thing you mentioned before, just a brief aside of this, can't unsee it. So in the CS education literature, that's sometimes called what's called a threshold concept. So a threshold is like, it's like you've crossed this threshold, right? So they have some, I'm not super familiar with all of them that they've identified, but like there are certain things that like they're called threshold concepts. So once you get it, like getting the concept of aliasing or something, you can't unsee it, right? You always will get it. But it's so hard for students to get to that point unless someone really shows you well.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize how formalized it was. But of course, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because once you identify those, if you can get people over the gap, well, they're ready to just proceed, right? Just start understanding what data structures do or understanding how reference counting works. But before that, it's kind of this weird, fuzzy world that you don't really understand even what refers to what else. And so how do you understand how
exactly
works,
and
right?
there's I don't personally do this kind of research, but I've read up on a lot of it. It's just giving even small bits of code to beginners and just seeing what diagrams they draw. And this is very like cognitive science, right? It's very much like what mental representations are you building in your head? And people of all sorts, they draw the arrows backwards, they draw like boxes in other boxes, they draw like variables pointing to other variables. And it's like, if you have the students explain it, it all makes sense in their mind, right? But like, because the thing with programming is it's all an artificial construct, right? Like it's, I think for people like us and your listeners who've been doing programming for a while, it seems so natural to us, but it's all artificial, right? It's all just made up a bunch of rules that are made up.
Yeah, I mean, our boxes and our lines, those are conceptual ideas, but at least the concept isn't incongruent with the way the computer works. But the computer doesn't actually care about these concepts to a large degree, right? It just has pages of memory and numbers and whatnot.
That's right. And I think that's another, more rabbit holes that we might have time to go down, but it's just, what diagram should we draw, right? Like, should we draw the bits of memory? Should we draw, the quantum states of the atoms, right? And, obviously for Python, we want something a bit more abstract, right? And the whole point of abstraction in these higher level languages, you don't have to worry about all the bits of memory. You just worry about conceptual data structures and such.
It's interesting. It's all about finding the best conceptual model that is both accurate, but not too low level that you get lost in the details, but not too high level that you don't understand the important parts, right? I think that programming and computer science, there's a lot of just having the right mental model.
Yeah, and from the machine side, it's the right abstractions, right? It's really like the abstractions for your mind, right? And I'm sure, because you teach a lot of these online courses and you make your own materials and stuff, and we can talk about that, but like, I'm sure you think a lot about, in these domain specific things. If you're teaching async programming, what diagram should I draw, right? I don't know,
Yes.
Is it high level, is it low level? What is enough of an abstraction so that people can actually understand it and do stuff with it, but it's not too low level to get people confused.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges I see in teaching in general, also in like async, for example, but in general is having the right levels. Often you want to have something that's easy to understand, but if you give all the detail, it's just too much.
Yeah.
If it's too easy, people go, oh, that's fake. That's not real. I need to actually understand what's going on. And so you've got to walk this tight line. And that's also in the applications you present, right? Do you present something that's easily understandable, but not real? Or do you rebuild Instagram? And people are like, what is all this, caching? And what is this database thing? And like, I just want to know a little bit about web development. So yeah, it's definitely interesting. I actually, for a course I'm working on, have been really diving into pythontutor.com.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
All right.
So So I'm working on a course called Python for Absolute Beginners, or Python for the Absolute Beginner. So it's kind of like what I'm hoping to be is a first-year computer science course for people who don't think they want computer science. What I mean is like take away all the abstract sort of theoretical stuff and just talk enough about data structures and pointers to understand like the shared list concept and whatnot. And it turns out Python Tutor is really good for creating those pictures. I was thinking about how do I draw them? Maybe I could hook up my iPad with my Apple Pencil and I could do some stuff, or I could obviously make some graphics. But it's really nice to just walk people through, let's throw this into pythontutor.com and see what it does. Let's just step through it. And the other thing I think is interesting is it's not like you just drop code in there and say, run this, and out pops the resulting in-memory structures and values and so on. But you can step line by line and see how the pointers and the data structures evolve, and you can even step backwards. This portion of Talk Python to Me is brought to you by Tidelift. Tidelift is the first managed open source subscription, giving you commercial support and maintenance for the open source dependencies you use to build your applications. And with Tidelift, you not only get more dependable software, but you pay the maintainers of the exact packages you're using, which means your software will keep getting better. The Tidelift subscription covers millions of open source projects across Python, JavaScript, Java, PHP, Ruby, .NET, and more. And the subscription includes security updates, licensing, verification and indemnification, maintenance and code improvements, package selection and version guidance, roadmap input, and tooling and cloud integration. The bottom line is you get the capabilities you'd expect and require from commercial software, but now for all the key open source software you depend upon. Just visit talkpython.fm/tidelift to get started today.
A big part of this tool is that it's step by step. So let's say your code runs for 100 steps, and it brings you to UI that has a slider and a button, 2 buttons that goes forward and back, and you can scrub back and forth to go forward and back on all the steps. And this works because all the code is already run on the server, right? It runs all 100 steps. And the idea behind this tool is not meant for, giant pieces of code. So the code doesn't run for that many steps if it's just a few lines of code. And we can exhaustively run it and then collect the in-memory trace at every one of those 100 or 1,000, whatever steps. And then we bring it back to the front end. And then every time you do a step, either forward or back, we just render that in a visual form. So like you said, people can go at their own pace and go back and forth and try to see, what just happened between this line and this line? Or why this thing do that? And, hopefully some people can figure out on their own, right? If they have some intuitions about it. But, even if they can't, then they can use this as a tool to show their friend and say, can you explain why this thing goes down and doesn't copy it? And at least there's something to talk about rather than just saying, my code doesn't work.
Yeah, there's a lot of people just throwing code out onto Stack Overflow or whatever, but you could permalink back into these examples, right? So you could actually put it in there and you could say, you see this step 5, this is where your conception has gone off the rails, and my answer applies to that right there. See this picture, right?
Yeah, and it's cool because, the nice thing about taking advantage of the web as a medium is that URL concept is so powerful, right? So not only the code is embedded in the URL, the step number is as well. So if you're at a diagram, step 20 out of 50 and you see something funny, you can send someone a link, and then when it goes to that link, it'll run the code and it'll step to the step 20, and then they can, you can ask them about that. So people have posted on Stack Overflow and on discussion forums for like a MOOC, like an online course and stuff. They just here's a Python tutor link. Can you tell me what's going on here?
Yeah, and it's used in some textbooks, and it's used in, like you said, some of the MOOCs, massive online courses, whatever the MOOC stands for, I forgot.
Yeah. Yeah, the massive open online courses. Yeah, so it's used by a few texts. So like Brad Miller, who was on your podcast pretty early on, who has this Runestone Interactive and Interactive Python textbooks. Also, it's used in UC Berkeley's introductory course, which is, I think, one of the biggest intro programming courses probably in the world, right? It's over 1,500 students a term, almost 2,000. They can't even fit in a lecture hall. They have to give several sessions. And it's, because UC Berkeley is a giant school for computer science, and all their students have to take Intro Python, and they're using the Python tutor all throughout their course materials. And a bunch of other schools use it too that I haven't even kept track of.
Yeah, that's got to be a pretty rewarding feeling to have that many folks using it and benefiting from it.
Yeah, it's really nice. I mean, it's been, we can talk about the organic growth and everything, but, every day we have maybe, over 10,000 probably active users a day, and it's just on a site. The other thing that is relatively new since the last time we talked was this live help mode. So there's a public help queue. So if you just if you're, brave enough to press a get help button, you actually put your session on a help queue. And anybody on the site, whether they're like a tutor who are just hanging out on the site or just another student who is just procrastinating or just, stuck on their own problem, they can click your name and you join a shared session. And it's as though you have like a screen share in the browser, and you can see each other's mice and you can walk through and write code together and then also chat in a little chat box. So we have like a few dozen people a day using this feature and like getting help from just absolute strangers around the world. And it's basically like a Stack Overflow like thing, except it's real time and it's private. So it's, they're not, shy about posting their questions, and it's private and it's chat based, and it's that's been really successful.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I did see that when I was messing with trying to visualize the code that I was trying to explain. I did see, so-and-so from Argentina, or a user from Argentina is asking for help on Python. So-and-so from Germany is asking for help on C++ or whatever. And there's a little button that just says help them.
Yeah, and you can just jump in, and it's all very it's all self-moderating, right? It's all voluntary. If you don't like it, you can just leave. There's no, no private information being exchanged. It's very kind of lightweight, and it's worked really well so far, just because it's, the community is still relatively modestly sized, right? So that the people on the site are, they're usually pretty well behaved because they're there because they're trying to learn or genuinely wanting to help each other. It really reminds me of, the good parts of the internet in a sense, right? Where people are actually, helpful and friendly to each other.
Yeah, that is actually really nice. There's not the permanent snarkiness, right? You just go there to help people or whatever.
Yeah, and there's no harm done. If you can't help, you say sorry, good luck, and someone else might jump in and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So you talked about some interesting things that it does. Maybe we could just talk a little bit about that before we get into the history and just the maintaining of it. So I have this Python code or this C++ code, and I want to put it onto your server and run it. That already seems a little interesting and risky. The other one is you've talked about it being stateless, and yet there's all these interesting things like I can bookmark and share this code on step 5 with this visualization run, or I can have this interactive chat with these people and so on. So how does that all work?
The blog post that I think you'll link to is about, maintaining and scaling the system as just one person, right? And we'll talk about that in later on the show. But one of the, design principles, or inadvertent design principles, is that I didn't want to have like much permanent state at all. So, for the most part, I call it's stateless in the sense that the state is all explicit, right? So like if you visit the site, for every URL you go to, that state is completely in the URL. So if you go to the site, it's blank code. You start typing, and if you want to save your code, quote unquote, the only way to do that is to create a URL, and your code is actually in the URL.
Is it like base64 encoded or something like that?
Yeah, something. Yeah, I don't think it's even compressed, but you can imagine compressing it. And it's probably base64, some kind of encoded. It's all in the URL. And the thing is, like, modern URLs are like, you can be up to, a few megabytes and stuff. I mean, it's not recommended, but you can fit a fair amount of code in there. And again, the tool isn't for a lot of code, right? So it's like, a few lines of code. It's in the URL. And then also the status of, do you want to execute this code? Which step do you want to be on? What options do you have toggled? They're all just, parameters in the URL. So the nice thing about that is that I don't have a database, right? There's no database anywhere. There's no user accounts. Like, you don't register, we don't keep track of your history of your code. There's none of the, the frills of like an online editor. Like what you mentioned about the chat is, of course, there is a chat server, right? There is you need a chat server in order to maintain that. And I guess the chat server has in-memory state, but like that doesn't keep any on disk state, right? So like if my server gets rebooted or something crashes, then at the worst that happens is your chat session dies, and then you hope to wait till the server auto reboots, and then, you reconnect and stuff. So it's very, very janky like that.
Well, I think that's actually really interesting. It's all about the trade-offs, right? What do you want to build? Are you trying to build a community around this thing? Or are you trying to build a tool? And one of the things we're going to dive into is this is something that you've grown quite a bit, even though you have a full-time job and you're not getting paid for it. And it's sort of focusing on one thing that you really wanted to build instead of just letting it grow and grow. Because there are so many knock-on effects from the stuff that you're talking about, right? So once you have user accounts, well, now you have to have email. Yep. Because one of the very first features of a website that gets used is, I can't log in, I forgot my email, click here to reset it. Like within hours of launching my site, that thing got used right away, right? It means, as users were just signing up, that thing got used. And once you have email, you got to worry about spam, and then you've got to worry about the American Can Spam Act. You've got accounts, and now you've got to worry about GDPR policies and all these. The tentacles of it just grow like crazy, right? And then there's the support stuff that goes on, and it's so easy to ask for these simple things. And we haven't even talked about patching databases and migrations and backups and those kinds of things, right? So, and it's fine if that's what you want to build, go do it. I went and built something kind of like that with my platform, but it's not your main job or your main focus, right?
Yeah, that's a great, as you were talking about all those things, it just made me,
have this warm feeling of,
all these,
I don't have to worry about any of that.
Either that or vicariously feeling, because, I know folks like yourself, and I have other friends who are building their own software businesses, essentially, their own SaaS businesses. And of course, if you're building a business and you have users, and not to mention having money involved, right? You have payment processing.
Oh, right. We haven't even talked about bank
accounts
and merchant accounts and all that kind of stuff. That's a whole nother level.
Yeah. And I like your framing of just from, minute one of login, right? Like just saying, let's say just want to have accounts from the minute people log in, people are going to forget their password, and then they need an email reset, and then you need to send out emails. So you need to figure out how to not get on everyone's spam filters and all these. And then if you keep any user data, there's all these laws, and you want to term the service, and then when you have money involved and stuff. So yeah, so my goal with all this, this all started out as just like a personal project in grad school, almost 10 years ago. And like many, I followed a lot of these independent creators and independent open source developers. And a lot of these projects just start out like mine, right? There's someone's personal itch, someone has a personal interest. They start a project, it starts small, and then it organically grows. And then it just depends on what people's goals are with it. And for myself, I'm in a very traditional academic role. My day job is teaching and doing research and all the professorly things. And it just happens that I have this thing that I keep running, and it's been beneficial to me both in terms of my research and teaching, obviously, and also just publicity and just, general personal enrichment. But then on the other hand, I want to be very careful about scoping it so that it doesn't, take over my whole life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of the blessing and the curse of popular things, be it a free website or an open source project like SQL Alchemy or something like that. All of a sudden, all these people are asking you to help add this feature or do this thing, or I can't get it to work. Can you help me with this? And yeah, it can just overwhelm you, right? A lot of people get burnt out trying to deal with that. And not even to mention the folks who come along, ask for help, which is clearly uninformed sort of foundations. And then they're angry if you won't take an hour out of your day to help them.
Right. Yeah, I think everyone has experiences of that. Yeah, I think everybody, we've seen a lot of blog posts and things on Twitter, and it's a very common, sentiment. Basically, I think if you've maintained any piece of software, whether it's your own business or it's an open source one, when you get thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of users, even if 99% of the users are great, that 1% or the 0.1% of bad interactions can just be really bad, just because kind of a large numbers thing, right? And then those bad interactions really sour your mood for the whole day and such. So
right. And it's not just that there's only just a couple of them, right? There might just be one a week, but the human psychology of it is we feel the negativity much more than we feel the either explicit, hey, thanks, this thing really helped me, or even just the satisfied people using it and not saying anything, right? But that negative stuff, that sticks with you and it can really drag you down. If you could somehow wash it away with the 10,000 other good experiences, you could drown it out. But that's just not how people are.
Yeah. And I think Brett Cannon has talked a lot about that. So, Brett is one of the core Python developers, and he's written some great blog posts, given some great talks and interviews about that concept, and others as well, right? My blog post links to a bunch of prior work from other people talking about, open source maintenance and burnout and this sort of volunteer labor, right? And I learned a lot from reading a lot of this stuff through the years, and I explicitly want to design this project so that I hopefully don't suffer from that, right? Because, that's not my full-time job to do open source.
Right. And you want to have a healthy psychology and feel good about yourself and not just feel beat up all day. That's great. So in terms of the history of Python Tutor, basically this is something that you created in grad school, right? And it's taken off. It kind of rode the wave of MOOCs and online education and interactive books and all that. And since then, you've mostly been able to just sort of keep the lights on and add a few features, not spend tons of time on it. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah. So I think it started around 2010. And then the first few years, I would say 2010 to 2013, those first 3 or so years were very active in development, right? Both because I was still in school, so I had much more free time. And then also the MOOCs, the massive open online courses, MOOCs were coming online around the early 2010s, Khan Academy, a lot of these paid online courses, right, on platforms like yours and a bunch of other Lynda and Pluralsight, and all these platforms are coming on. Also like Hour of Code and a lot of this, teaching everyone programming and kids getting into programming. So there's just so much energy in the first half of this decade around online tools for programming. And then fortunately, a lot of the intro courses were taught in Python. So then I had this tool that had very good organic Google searches they call it Python Tutor. And as more people used it, more people found it, and they linked to it from their blogs and from online courses and online textbooks and lecture notes and stuff. And it just really grew. And then, like you said, last five years or so, it's mostly been in maintenance mode because I've been, very busy with my early professor career and such.
Right. And that's a critical time in that career for sure to make it through to tenure and so on. This portion of Talk Python to Me is sponsored by Clubhouse. Clubhouse is a fast and enjoyable project management platform that breaks down silos and brings teams together to ship value, not features. Great teams choose Clubhouse because they get flexible workflows where they can easily customize workflow states for teams or projects of any size. Advanced filtering, quickly filtering by project or team to see how everything is progressing. Effective sprint planning, setting their weekly priorities with iterations and then letting Clubhouse run the schedule. All the core features are completely free for teams with up to 10 users. As TalkPython listeners, you'll get 2 free months on any paid plan with unlimited users and access to the premium features. So get started today. Visit talkpython.fm/clubhouse. That's talkpython.fm/clubhouse. So you have an interesting quote in the article that I'll link to that you talk about the maintaining this as a solo open source developer and so on. You say that Python Tutor is probably, as far as you know, the most widely used piece of open source software that's maintained by a single active assistant professor. That's quite an interesting statistic. I think you may be right.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, right? That's always good to say as far as I know, because it's true. As far as I know, it's true. Yeah, so the quote there was about an assistant professor, someone who's, basically in the first 5 or 6 years of their career.
Tenure track, but not yet tenured, right?
Yeah, so tenure track means that, I'm on a path to work toward getting tenure, but I'm not there yet. So, you're basically at, these big universities, it's a lot about publishing, getting grants, writing research papers, teaching well, all that stuff goes in your portfolio. And, building open source software is not really part of that portfolio. Although there are people who do it because that's part of their research lab, right? So,
right.
And I guess my, somewhat claim to fame is I think out of people who are early in their careers, I don't know of anybody who's really been maintaining software that's been so widely used. And there's, of course, software projects that are much more widely used. So, the Jupyter project is a great example, right? So Jupyter Notebooks and the whole Jupyter ecosystem, that has started out of academia. And now there's a lot of industry partnerships, but that's, a big team effort with a lot of funding it's a big team effort. It's not just one person in their home office hacking away late at night.
Yeah, for sure. There's a bunch of folks that work on that. Another example that came to mind was Sage Math. Are you familiar with Sage Math and William Stein's work? So yeah, he was at University of Washington near Seattle, and he worked on Sage Math. I don't think he did it solo, but he actually left academics to just focus on Sage Math and the platform. I interviewed him many years ago, and I hopefully he's still doing well. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the pressure, right? Is for him, he's like, I can't do both. I'm going to just go work on this project, which is, it seems pretty interesting, but you got to balance it, right?
Yeah, it just depends on priorities, right? Yeah, so William is quite a bit more senior than I am. I mean, he made tenure and a full professor, so he advanced quite a bit in the ranks in University of Washington as a math professor. And all the meantime, obviously his passion has been making the Sage project for computational mathematics. And that, again, I think that started with him, right? Like many projects, and then it grew and to the point where, he wrote some great blog posts about this kind of over the years of how it's really hard to sustain this in academia, especially if it's growing, because that's not really your day job, right? It's hard to get funding for it. It's hard to get students to work on it. But then, he decided, at least as of, a year or two ago, he decided to quit his professor job and full time just basically run it as a business, right? I think it's still open source, but there's, a consultancy model and hosted and everything.
Yeah, there's paid hosting cloud version as well. That's interesting. Have you considered, you are subject to the publish or perish segment of your career, right? So have you considered publishing things about Python Tutor on, say, JOSS, the Journal for Open Source Software, or something like that?
So far, actually, this whole thing about Python Tutor in these past few years, it's not just, for my own personal enrichment or benefit in the world. There's actually a great career benefit as well. So because the platform has a lot of users, I'm actually able to use it to do data analysis or to run experiments or to deploy these user surveys like for the older adults. So imagine it's hard to reach thousands of older adults coding all around the world if you don't have a platform that you can just deploy surveys
especially beginner coders,
exactly,
right? Like the advanced ones, you can go through the standard dev channels, but
Stack Overflow or whatever.
Yeah, it's really hard to reach the beginners though.
Yeah, so I've actually been able to, my students and I've actually been able to do a good amount of research on the platform. So we have a bunch of papers using the platform, but you're right, we haven't actually thought about writing technical papers about the system itself per se. And part of it is just the lack of time and priorities. Yeah. And the hope is in the future, if I have more time to think about these things, I might transition to that. But so far, like you're saying, I've been down a much more traditional, academic research route. So our papers are much more academic in nature, which is good because I obviously like doing that too, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's the right fit. All right, so let's talk a little bit about your article. And you basically laid out the various steps and trade-offs. I think trade-offs is the key word or key underpinning here of how can you both keep this very popular thing going and yet focus on your academic career. And you have a ton of students, right, at UCSD that need to come to office hours, and you need to grade their papers or their code and work with them, and that already is draining. You probably don't want to go and then take care of a bunch of issues and bugs and stuff afterwards that you don't need to bring upon yourself, right? So you kind of laid out some of the steps that you went through, and it's a little bit of a counter example of what people say you should do to be a really good open source maintainer. And it all comes back to, where do you want this thing to lead you to? Do you want to create requests of a super popular library, or do you want to create Jupyter? Or do you want to keep this thing interesting and useful while not letting it consume your life, right?
Yeah. And I've definitely chosen, sustainability as the highest priority, right? It's like, I like this thing, it's running well, it could sustain itself. But if I try to grow it in any way, really, I feel like it's at a good equilibrium now. And if I try to do more stuff, it would just create more work, right? Doing more stuff just creates more work and such. So, and I like your framing of it, kind of a counter example. I think the explicit framing of the article, which people can read, is that there's all these best practices that people talk about in open source, which I'm sure many people on your podcast have talked about, building a community, being responsive to users, having good documentation, good tutorials, just
inviting great collaborators.
Stuff. That's right. Inviting collaborators, maintaining a community, both of users and of contributors and such. And I basically try to turn every one of these best practices, and think about the opposite, right? Because my use case is that I don't want to grow this. I want this to keep going, but I don't want to,
right.
grow
it.
Well,
I do think one of the key missing elements or key assumptions is, of course, I want my open source project to be the most widely used and highest contributed to thing, period. Right. And that may be, but if it's not, then maybe that advice no longer applies.
Yeah, I like that. I like the framing actually. And on a related note, this is kind of, you read these blog posts about in the technology world, right? There's always more technologies coming about. You can do Kubernetes and you can do all these crazy setups and you have all these new cloud engines and all platforms and stuff. And then, there's these people
who are like, framework, so you can use the new async stuff and all that, right?
Yeah. And then people are just like, all right, you can just chill because you're not running Facebook or Google or Twitter. If you're just starting a minimal viable product or a small business, something, just pick something that works. It's fine. Just build your product out. And I feel very similar, right? I don't use all the new technologies. I don't, my tech stack is pretty old and pretty crufty, but it kind of works. And as long as it keeps working and it's reasonable, I don't want to poke it at all because, I don't want to have to deal with anything breaking.
Right. Well, if you're trying to chase the most modern JavaScript front-end framework, think how many times you'd rewrite that.
Right. Exactly.
Right. It's Angular. No, we're angry at Angular now. So it's Vue. Oh, Vue went to 3 and people are upset about something there. So now it's React. It goes and goes and goes, right? So pretty interesting. So let me just take you through some of the key points in the article that you talked about, some of the steps you've taken to help keep this balance that you talked about. And one that I think we've already hit on a lot is you hyper-focused on a single use case.
Yeah, so the main use case, or I guess the only use case, is emulating what a teacher would draw on the board, right? So I felt like that focus is great because that gets rid of a lot of the scalability issues, right? Because you're like, oh, I need to run arbitrary code, and like, how do you render, a bunch of code and a bunch of diagram stuff? And it's like, no, the way to use this is think about what would a teacher draw on the board. If the teacher can't draw on the board, you probably can't understand anyways, because, that's not for the use case. And also, if you have too much code, if your code is too complex, we just throw up our hands and, we bring you to like an unsupported features page and be like, all right, this is really outside of the scope of this tool. So focus really helps, eliminating feature creep.
Right. We already talked about databases, email, reset passwords, accounts, GDPR, all that kind of stuff, right? And just saying, look, we just need this really cool diagramming, this auto diagramming feature. This is what we're going to focus on. It's been really successful. And I think that leads pretty naturally into not listening to user requests, right? People ask for accounts or social gamification or integration with GitHub or programmer like autocomplete like PyCharm or Visual Studio Code or an LMS, all these different things people are asking for, right?
Yeah, I mean, these are all great ideas. If other people want to build them, or if I had a team to build this, that'll be great. But again, it's just, if it's only me, there's no way to implement all those.
Yeah, they all do sound fun, but it's one of those things where you want to ask, could you just make this small change? And let's focus it down, not just from a whole application, but let's just take it down to a little library, right? Some open source library you got. Could you just add this overload or this default value to this function? Or could you just add one other function that does something slightly different? It's probably only 3 lines to write. Please do that. Why won't you do that? Well, because now I got to go write a bunch of tests, and then I've got to go rewrite the documentation. And then there was that screenshot that showed the output, but now the output is different. So I got to go regenerate screenshots for all these things. And then I got to rewrite the tutorial because now this would be an alternative way. And there's just this 3 lines blows up into a week-long experience, right? It's super hard to see those knock-on effects.
Yeah, it's like you could have this whole hour just you talking to yourself, because I mean, it's like you basically said all these things way better than I could, right? That's right. That these things just keep piling up, and I think that goes with the focus, right? Like if you really focus on providing one thing, and an anecdote here is that I don't have any flexibility in how the diagrams are. I'm sure you've run into this too. You're like, oh, I really wish this diagram was drawn in a slightly different way.
Yeah,
and
like, could the list go across and then the stuff link up behind?
So it's just like, yeah, too bad, right? Because to make it more flexible is just a lot more work. And in a way, I kind of view this tool as, because it's kind of pretty stable, I just said, if as an instructor, you want to work around it, you just basically would explain. It's like, oh, this is a tool, it works, but just be careful that, this thing actually should point backwards or whatever. And early on, I have a little anecdote here. I actually did work with a few professors. This is way in the early days, right? And I actually customized several versions. Some version they wanted the pointer drawn this way. And then I had a few versions for different classes, just because these are my friends and colleagues, right? And also, it was early on, so I wanted to help them out. But after a while, I'm like, all right, there's no way I can do this for everybody, right? Like, so this is the canonical graphic, the visualization, take it or leave it.
Yeah. I think it's fine. If you need a better picture, use a whiteboard or
manually draw it yourself.
Yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah, draw it either on a chalkboard, a whiteboard, or like some sort of digital equivalent, right? Here's the picture I want to draw, and this is actually how it should look, right? I think that's probably just fine.
Yep.
Nice. The next one up in the article was that you resist talking to users.
Yeah, that's a very very, very blunt way to put it. Yeah, so in the early days, it was great because I had my email address on the site, and it was very helpful to talk to users and get bug reports and feature requests, because that was how I was able to iterate on the tool so well. Mm-hmm. So I'm very grateful for the early users. I mean, this is even though I put it so bluntly, I put an asterisk. I'm like, in the beginning, it was awesome. But then after the tool stabilized after a few years, there wasn't anything obvious I wanted to add. Then, the bug reports just were corner cases or things that have already been said before, or like, could you do this? I'm like, no, this is way too complicated. So then instead what I do is I have a very comprehensive kind of FAQ / unsupported features page. And that lists out basically anything people would ask. It kind of lists it out. And if people actually ask something that's unusual, I would add it to the FAQ. And that seems to work reasonably well.
Yeah, that's really nice. Instead of just answering it privately over email, which is frustrating, find a way to answer it in a public, permanent form, so it can just stay. And you could just either just have an autoresponder that says, first you need to look here, and then you can email me or something like that, right?
Yeah, and basically now when there's an error message on the site for whatever reason, right? Either it's a user triggered error or just like the server went down or something. I just put a little link to the page. They can just go read the page. Whereas before I put my email address, and then obviously if I have an email address, people would just email me a lot. So again, this is like the thing with design, right? Like if you want to create less work for yourself, then, make yourself less available.
Right, absolutely. So another one that you decided to do is not to go and explicitly try to do marketing to promote the thing, but more somehow you just sort of grew organically in the MOOC era and have been going strong since then.
Yeah. And I'm a really big fan of following, a lot of these open source conferences, PyCon and others, and watching their videos and seeing how people, promote and market and spread the word about their open source project. But again, it's just a time thing, right? It's like I have to spend my time giving talks and traveling on much more academic, and research conferences and stuff. It's actually something I would love to do in the future, when I have a bit more kind of freedom and time to. I would love to explore this world of non-academic conferences because it's like I've been to many academic conferences, all pretty similar, right? It's all the stereotypes that you hear about, and I would love to participate in things like PyCon and OzCon and all these things, but it's just a priority for me at this point that I haven't really prioritized it.
Sure, yeah, trade-offs. The other one that you mentioned that we have covered fairly deeply is keeping everything stateless.
Yeah. So just briefly on that is that I don't have a persistent database. Yeah. I guess by stateless, I mean, there's no persistent data store.
Right. Sure. There might be in-memory chat logs to sync that up, but that's not the same as I need to migrate Postgres to the latest version or had a failure, so we had to go over to the backup cluster. Like that's not a problem you worry about.
Yeah, there's none of that. I mean, basically it's, I have, I just reboot the servers periodically if something, it's pretty bad. I mean, it's like, there's some weird memory leak issues because maybe with Docker, maybe with something else. I don't know. That's the point, right? I don't actually know. I don't bother debug. So I just have some cron job that just checks my memory usage. And if the memory usage starts spiking too high for too long, I just reboot the server and it's all, and I think I have a few servers, so it kind of, load balances. So like, it seems to work like pretty well. And at worst, it's a free thing. People will just go try again a minute later and it works. It's been holding up for a few years like this. This is not a way to run, DevOps or sysadmin at all, but it works.
Yeah, no, look, practicality definitely beats the purity of, absolutely. You're saying this as like, I'm just this guy. I got to just keep it working and I can't be debugging this weird Docker issue. So you know what? Just forget it. We're just going to reboot it every now and then. If you were a real company, you would definitely not do this. But on the other hand, there's a really cool article from Instagram's engineering blog called Dismissing Python Garbage Collection at Instagram. And you can go import GC and say gc.disable in Python, and it'll turn off the generational garbage collector that catches the cycles. But because most of the stuff is caught on reference counting, you can actually live for a long time. So they ended up doing that in production and saving tons of memory usage because they got better memory sharing across like the forked out processes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they just reboot it because eventually you got a bunch of cycles. You got to get rid of it. So they just recycle the processes.
That's great.
So the same thing, right? Like it's not as crazy as it sounds, I guess.
Yeah, and this is like that's great. That's that's an engineering hack in the in the truest sense of the word, right? That it's like a simple and kludgy solution, but I'm sure it saves them all sorts of time and money. Both the you can imagine calculating literally the savings of money in the data centers from that efficiency, and also the savings of money in paying engineers to debug and maintain all that. If they had implemented a more complicated custom memory allocator scheme, it just takes all this money for highly paid engineers to maintain all that, right? It's like, no, we'll just reboot it.
Yeah, exactly. It's so weird that they get actually better performance by just letting it leak memory. But apparently, under the right use case, they definitely do. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Another, maybe put a couple things together, like kind of in that bucket are, I'm not super worried about performance or reliability, and we already mentioned, not super dedicated to staying up on the latest version of the hot new web framework or whatever.
Yeah, and actually, the ironically, me having a very stable sort of setup is kind of good for reliability in a sense, because, if I try to change anything around, it might fail in some weird way. If I'm always upgrading the latest libraries or latest frameworks, there might be some weird memory leak that's undiagnosed, right? But if I stick with, super old, sort of, kind of a LAMP stack, super old setups, those things are pretty, Apache, and those things are pretty well debugged. and fairly stable. But on the other hand, I'm not trying to squeeze every ounce of performance out, right? That it works well enough. Sometimes you have to wait a little longer if the server's busy or you have to retry. But, this is not, Wall Street, high-speed trading or something.
Yeah, maybe some large lecture is just finished, or they said, everybody open up your laptops and try this. Like, all 1,000 of you go here now and try this. Maybe you run into it. But my experience was it was super fast and it was totally fine. I had no latency issues. And I think that's interesting because I feel like so much the trade-offs that we consider, imagine a world where we're so successful that we can barely stand it. You know what I mean? Like, what if we're featured on the front page of Forbes, or we're stuck to the top of Hacker News for like 3 weeks, or, Product Hunt, and just the people come and they just crush it. I think people really don't appreciate, a lot of people, not everyone, a lot of people don't really appreciate how much traffic just simple Pyramid Flask Django on a $10 server can handle. I mean, my server, we get millions of requests. We do like 15 terabytes of data traffic exchange. It's ridiculous. And it's like the CPU usage is 5%. It's nothing.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the point earlier that we mentioned, these blog posts about, don't worry about designing for scale up front, right? This is, it's a classic case, the modern instance of premature optimization, right? It's like, I think a lot of this premature optimization is, as software developers, we often like to try out new technologies and try to, they're intellectually interesting, right? Like, oh, if we can hook this up and this up, it's intellectually interesting. And I feel personally, it's sort of like procrastination from thinking about your product, right? So it's like the hard thing when you're building either open source or a product or anything is the actual product and talking to users and the real core of what you really, whether you're building something people really want, right? Because then you have to actually talk to people and face criticism. But
or write documentation or tutorials or other boring stuff in your mind that's not like cutting edge. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you just yak shave on building the best, tech stack, then, no one's going to tell you no. But then, you might over engineer that. So for me, it's not that I'm some, engineering genius. It's just I didn't have time to do any of this. I stuck with whatever stuff was available 10 years ago, right? So that's another thing that people ask, like, oh, do you use all these things? Like, they didn't exist 10 years ago. So of course I didn't use it. I haven't really upgraded it at all.
Yeah. Super interesting. The other last two, I guess, kind of fit together as well. As the code is available on GitHub and I'll link to it, but you don't make it super easy for people to work on and you don't have a lot of contributors.
Yeah. So this is kind of like the last part. Like, when people talk about open source, another assumption that people have is that open source projects have a community of both users and contributors, right? Like you think about these projects with contributors and, GitHub pull requests and issues and all this very vibrant thing of open source. And for me, it's like it's open source in the strictest sense is that the source code is open and there's a valid open source license on the code. So you can use it, you can put in your products, whatever you want according to the licenses. It's not quote unquote open source in that I don't foster a community contributor. So I explicitly don't spend time on documenting the code or telling people really in the instructions for how to install it or run on their own servers or under different edge cases and stuff. And also I don't really solicit contributions, right? That anyone can fork the code and, use it. I'm sure people use it in all sorts of ways I don't even know. And that's the great part about it. But I don't personally have time to, merge the contributions and manage all of this complexity around, when you go from one developer, myself, to anybody who's more than one, you're dealing with a team project you have to manage. And I just didn't want to deal with that.
Yeah. And it's another one of these knock-on effects of, well, it would be great to have people to contribute, but then your code has to be a little bit higher quality so that it's easier for them to do so. Oh, and then also you got to make sure that you have proper test coverage completely across the board, because if they contribute something and the Travis CI automation says it passes, well, is it really broken? Now you got to go test it. I mean, like here we are again going down this rat hole, which if that's the direction, right? Like it's about where you want to go. Like I said at the beginning, if that's the way you want to go, you definitely want to do that. But if that's not the way you want to go, then maybe that's not the right thing.
Yeah, totally. And I think you summarized it really. It's funny because every one of these points, you summarized the examples better than I could have.
Perfect. Well, I'm happy to do it. You wrote a good article that I read through and thought about. I guess an interesting term that I heard this from Scott Hanselman first, but maybe he heard it somewhere along the way. I don't know the original attribution, but I've heard of this type of project, at least the way you described it at the end, as source open. instead of open source. It's like the source is there, but it's not sort of participating in the whole PR flow. That said, you do have people who have contributed, right? Like the Java visualizers was done by other people and so on. So it's not that nobody contributes. It's more that you're not fostering it. So I think it probably counts as open source, and maybe the little asterisk, like limited for special cases.
Yeah, it's very limited. Yeah, and like the Java one's a great example because it was actually done by a professor who taught in Java. So like, it's funny to admit, I haven't done Java since like the beginning of college in one class, because I've just never worked in Java. I just never worked
that's
in
interesting. Let's go use something else.
Yeah, I mean, it just never happened. That just was never the world I worked in. I didn't work in, enterprise apps in the 2000s or widgets or applets or whatever. So he taught in Java, and he actually made a Java extension. He actually hosted it on his own site for a while, and then after a while, I actually merged his thing into the main thing because it was well contained, right? It was self-contained. It was its own thing. It just interfaced with my visualizer, and it works great. It works great. But the thing is, if anyone reports a bug in it, I'm just like, I have no idea what to do, because this guy has moved on to something else too. But I'm like,
software is as is.
It's as is. It's literally as is. I don't actually know Java. I don't know how to debug it. It's running some old version of Java. It's it works, and I don't want to touch it.
Right. Yeah. It's the version of Java from 6 years ago, but that's what it's going to be. It's all good. Nice. So at the end of the article, you said it's a bit of a fluke that Python Tutor is doing so well, that you've, all these millions of users who have visited it and benefit from it and so on. And the reason it's a bit of a fluke is your day job doesn't incentivize it. So let me ask you, what do you think? Do you think it should? I mean, I did mention the Journal of Open Source Software as a way to kind of like shoehorn it in a tad. But what are your thoughts on things like this in academics? And should academics get credit for these kinds of creations? I mean, it's clearly a value to the world if 10 million people are understanding code better through it. Yeah,
that's a great question. I mean, that could be its own hour. Right? And I obviously get that question a lot. I mean, the question is really about currently academic path, kind of research, studies, and publications and grants. All the more traditional metrics are the main thing. And I think that things are, broadening out in some fields, right? And, in fields like my own, in HCI, human computer interaction, user experience, a lot of our things are open source products that you write papers on, you do studies on. It's all very symbiotic. I think my kind of most clear stance on this is that, research is really about sharing generalizable knowledge with the world, right? So like an example is if I made Python Tutor, I just stuck the code on GitHub and said, here's the link. I think that by itself is not really any much generalizable knowledge. It's just a bunch of stuff. But like you mentioned, if I wrote about it in detail, I showed how it works for users. If I have some general design ideas, maybe these blog posts and these things, I think that there is a way to work that into a more scholarly sort of portfolio. And I see that now that I'm in, in a more interdisciplinary field, we have colleagues in visual arts, right? So in UC San Diego, we have a great visual arts department. What is their portfolio, right? Their portfolio is, they write some papers, they write some scholarly works, analysis, history, but a lot of the portfolio is my art pieces and my film. If you're a film professor or music professor, you're doing performances and stuff. So I think that the world of science is broadening out its definition more. And I definitely do see that broadening in the future. But, universities and academia is a very kind of traditional and slow-moving sort of institution.
It's a big ship to turn, yeah.
That's right. So for the time being, I still think that, like the ending of my article, I have a lot of students, especially, very programming-oriented students are like, oh, I want to be able to build software and stuff. And then I actually tell me, what's your goal? If your goal is to be working in industry or working in open source, that's great. But if your goal is still to build up a more traditional academic career, at least for the time being, the more traditional research and scientific studies are the way to go. And if you can do your science in a way that can foster open science and open source, which, some people have done very well, including some people we've interviewed, that's probably the most sustainable way, right? That you do your work in the open, but you also kind of adhere to more traditional scholarship as well. It's a lot of work, right? But that's the most practical way now.
Yeah, it does seem like it's shifting a little bit. But yeah, I definitely hear where you're coming from. I think some of the drivers are, hey, we have this great paper about, we just took the first picture of black holes, but oh, by the way, we can't actually take the pictures. We have to use artificial intelligence to interpret a bunch of different things to actually compile the picture. And how can you possibly write your article without somehow talking about what you built? There's probably a component that can be extracted out. I think as people are moving away from things like MATLAB and other proprietary, SAS and whatever proprietary systems, they're starting to get into open source, and it just draws them into building stuff that helps do their research. And I think that that's eventually going to put enough pressure to turn the ship a little.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that people at the more senior levels can have more flexibility in doing these sorts of things and advocating for that. And I think a lot of this stuff works from the top down too. Right? Already we've seen, the top down view is, if the funding agency, if the funding agencies say that you must put your code open, your data open and stuff, and which some funding, the NIH and NSF, they're starting to do that. I think those are great efforts because that at least gets people to think about, we might need to clean up our data and our code so that other people can use it. And eventually those, the stuff will percolate downward.
Yeah, I agree. And the reproducibility aspect that's becoming a bigger focus. It's always been super important, but now it's easy to test whether it's reproducible. So, I think that also leads to more of the code being open and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, this has been a super interesting conversation, but you got to answer the 2 questions before you get out of here. So if you're going to write some Python code, what editor do you use?
I still use Vim because I learned it in grad school, and I still use it, even though, everybody's on to Visual Studio Code by now. Again, just like with the old technologies, right? I've passed several generations, right? There was, Atom was big, Sublime was big, and VS Code is now, obviously really big. But yeah, I still use Vim, and that's just what I do.
We talk about these threshold concepts. There's probably some kind of theory about editors as well, and there's as well. Interesting. And then notable PyPI package, something that
that's really funny. Yeah, I was trying to prepare for this. Last time I gave this cop out answer, I'll just Anaconda or just this package manager and stuff. It's hilarious because I actually don't write a lot of Python code anymore, right? Because this Python tutor, it's all JavaScript, it's all web code.
That's the irony, right? That you've got to write the front end stuff. That's where all the magic is, and it's
that's
not,
right.
Yeah.
Ironically, I'll plug one thing. I was actually scrambling because I knew you were going to ask that question, Dan. I was scrambling to look at this is Python code I wrote for something else. This is code that I wrote to inventory my file system. So I've been basically doing a lot of stuff with basically kind of building my own personal archiving and rsyncing, Dropboxing kind of thing. And one of the problems is how do you just crawl through a directory hierarchy super fast when you have, a million files? And I've actually found, this is a plug for upgrading Python 3. I found that this is not a package, but the OS, the built-in OS library, os.walk. And os.walk, I believe, is this thing that's only in Python, I think 3.5 or above. And it's super fast, at least on the Mac. And I think, it's nice because it probably uses some system calls or stuff. And it's notably because I had, a Python 2.7 version before using Scander or some other thing, right? And if you upgrade to Python 3.5 and you use this function, OS walk, it just goes it's just thousands of times faster. And this is, people talk about this a lot, right? And that's one of the things that gets people to upgrade is that, if something just is slow and there's a new version of the API and a lot of things in the new Python standard library, I guess, are either drop-in replacements or a slightly different API, but it just goes so much faster. I just encourage people to look at that. So this is not a PyPI package. It's just
that counts. Yeah, like a useful library.
Re-looking at the standard. Yeah, just re-looking at the standard library for things that they optimize. And that was the first thing that came to my mind because I was just working on that code.
Very nice, very nice. All right, final call to action. People are either teachers or they're students. They're hearing about Python Tutor. They think it's maybe useful. What do you tell them?
I tell them that just go try out the site pythontutor.com. And to go participate in the community of just, helping each other out and, asking for help and such. And it's really community driven. So any help I can get on the site would be great. And also if they want to integrate it when they're teaching materials and stuff. And, despite what I say in my article, I actually really do like hearing from instructors and students in the piles of emails that I get. So I love hearing about how people are using it. So, if you have good user stories or interesting stories, I always write. Despite, again, in my article, I say, I don't listen to users, but I actually do listen to all the users. I actually write down all of their notes in the GitHub repo as notes of these are cool future directions. I don't think I have time to do this, but these are awesome suggestions. So I would just tell them to write that
down. So if once you get tenure or you have a sabbatical and you want to come back and spend some time on it, you can actually harness all that feedback.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that's always the dream of someday I'll get to make some of that. And then you just end up getting more busy over time because everyone does.
Exactly.
That's just the reality of life.
That's how life is. All right, Philip, it's been great to chat with you as always. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much again.
You bet. Bye. This has been another episode of Talk Python to Me. Our guest on this episode was Philip Guo, and it's been brought to you by Tidelift and Clubhouse. If you run an open source project, Tidelift wants to help you get paid for keeping it going strong. Just visit talkpython.fm/Tidelift, search for your package, and get started today. Clubhouse is a fast and enjoyable project management platform that breaks down silos and brings teams together to ship value, not features. Fall in love with project planning. Visit talkpython.fm/Clubhouse. Want to level up your Python? If you're just getting started, try my Python Jumpstart by Building 10 Apps course. Or if you're looking for something more advanced, check out our new async course that digs into all the different types of async programming you can do in Python. And of course, if you're interested in more than one of these, be sure to check out our Everything Bundle. It's like a subscription that never expires. Be sure to subscribe to the show. Open your favorite podcatcher and search for Python. We should be right at the top. You can also find the iTunes feed at /iTunes, the Google Play feed at /Play, and the direct RSS feed at /RSS on talkpython.fm. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Now get out there and write some Python code.